All right. Good afternoon, actually, it happens to be. Um, I only realized late that I thought I had, uh, I have narrated PowerPoint presentations for Hume, but I don't, and of course the notes, but I don't actually have a video recorded lecture. So I'm making them for that now by recording a lecture. And hang on one second. So my plan is to go through the PowerPoint lecture with you as a, there we are. So my plan is to go through the PowerPoint lecture with you. And I also actually added some additional notes on problems with David Hume's account of ethics, which did not appear in the original narrated PowerPoint. Okay, so there's a little more information at the end. So if you've already looked through the narrated PowerPoint, you don't want to do the whole thing again, you can kind of skip to the end and catch the additional stuff where I start talking about problems with Hume's ethics. All right, so let me share my screen. And the screen I want to share is this one. Share. Here we are. Okay. David Hume's ethics as sympathy. Hume was actually lumped together with certain other Scottish philosophers, and sometimes they were called the Scottish Sentimentalists, and it's because they were emphasizing the role of sympathy in our lives. Adam Smith, the economists always say the economist Adam Smith, but philosophers will often say the philosopher Adam Smith was likewise one of these Scottish sentimentalists. So, why isn't this working? So we're going to look at Hume's analysis of ethical terms and predicates, right? Now, you may recall that at the very beginning of our section on ethical reasoning, I had suggested that all the ethical theories that we're going to be looking at could be filed away in one of three folders: consequentialist, virtue ethics, and deontological, right? And those were all the files you needed to take care of the ethical theories that we are examining. Well, that's not exactly true, right? Sort of, it's true, but the reason why I think Hume doesn't easily fit into one of those three categories is because Hume is not so much interested in telling us what makes good actions good or bad actions bad, but rather what makes us label certain actions good and label certain actions bad. And so he really is talking about the psychological motivations that explain moral behavior and why we engage in moral language and why we use these terms and ascribe these qualities to certain behaviors. So that is a little abstract, but hopefully that'll become clearer as we go through this. So you may recall earlier in our class, Hume's fork, right? Remember that Hume suggested that sentences are justified either as relations of ideas, which are logical tautologies, or as matters of fact and existence, which would be empirical claims that we can verify through observation. But as we saw when we looked at logical positivism, we run into a problem with ethics because ethical sentences do not seem to be logical tautologies. All bachelors are unmarried males, or all vixen are foxes. Nor do they seem to be empirically verifiable in any straightforward way. So they don't seem to be either relations of ideas, nor do they seem to be matters of fact, right? Neither, really. Now, some have argued for this reason that ethical judgments must all be subjective. So in other words, when I make an ethical judgment, it's not literally a judgment. It's really an expression of some sort of subjective attitude. So when I say, I don't know, murder is wrong, I'm not saying something which is objectively true or false. What I'm really saying is something like this: I disapprove of murder. Or if you recall from when we looked at emotivism, what I'm saying is murder. Boo, murder, right? So it's not even a subjectively true or false claim. It's not even true or false. Ethical subjectivism basically claims that ethical judgments are claims about the subjective states of the speaker. So murder is wrong is really the claim the speaker disapproves of murder, right? That's what it really is. Or if I'm saying it, I am the speaker. When I say pronounce X is morally wrong, what I'm really doing is I'm using language to express the following claim: I disapprove of X, right? So again, what the subjectivists want to say is, if you carefully analyze what's going on in moral language, what you find out is moral language is really language about the speaker. It's not really language about the objective world per se. Consider, peaches are delicious, right? Well, if I said peaches are delicious, the grammar, notice if you were diagramming that sentence, right? Back from when something we did earlier in our course together, if you were diagramming that sentence, you'd have, on the one side, peaches, the verb within the bifurcate the line, and you have the next verb, are, and then that's a predicate adjective, so delicious. So you are predicating deliciousness of peaches, right? That's what the grammar suggests. Oh, but I didn't realize we went there. But notice if I say peaches are delicious, and you come back and you say peaches are not delicious, well, the grammar seems to suggest that we have a logical contradiction. We can't both be correct. Either they are delicious or they're not. Either they have this quality of deliciousness, which I am predicating, or they lack this quality of deliciousness, which you're denying that predication. And so, okay, who's right about this, right? What subjectivism wants to say is, don't be misled by the superficial grammar. You need to dig a little deeper to see what is really going on here. Let's say I came to you and I said, oh, I saw some great art this weekend. What would you know about the art that I saw? What fact would you know about the art that I saw? Well, very little. You'd know something about me. What would you know about me? That I enjoyed myself this weekend, right? That I, whatever that art was, I had a good time, that I liked it. So even though I seem to be talking about the art, I'm really expressing a truth about me. So that's the nature of subjectivism or subjectivist accounts of what's going on. When I make claims about taste, literal gustatorial taste, like delicious peaches, or when I make maybe aesthetic claims about art. And some have argued that's also what's going on when I make moral claims. Right? So in both of these cases, they seem to be telling you more about the speaker than about objective states of affairs. And that, of course, is what the subjectivist claims is going on. Hume's account of ethics shares with the subjectivist account that whether something is considered morally right or wrong has more to do with our subjective responses to the objective world than an objective fact about the world per se. So he shares that view with the subjectivist. However, he differs with the subjectivist in that he does not think everyone's subjective responses are equally relevant to determining whether an action is right or wrong. So what Hume adds to this is that some subjective responses to states of affairs are appropriate and correct, and certain states of responses to certain states of affairs are inappropriate or incorrect, right? And so we have to distinguish between what we might call ideal responses and what we might call pathological responses. We'll more on that in a moment. Indeed, in this respect, Hume resembles the moral objectivist in that he thinks one can be wrong in one's moral judgments about right and wrong. One's subjective judgments about moral matters might simply be mistaken. So the fact that you approve of some behavior does not guarantee that that behavior is right. It doesn't even guarantee that it's right for you. You might be simply wrong. You might be approving of something about which you ought not to approve. Or you might be disapproving about something about which you ought not to be disapproving. So that's different than the subjectivist. From the subjectivist, you are the final court of appeal, right? Again, you can't be wrong in your subjective responses from a subjectivist point of view. But Hume thinks you can be. Now, how does he make this out? Well, let's continue. What is it, he thinks, that we mean when we say things like, that is good, or he is a wicked man, right? What do we mean when we use these phrases? What are we achieving, or what are we going on to assert, or what motivates us to even engage in that kind of linguistic behavior in the first place? This is what he's thinking about, David Hume. Hume claims that there's a certain kind of emotion which all or nearly all humans experience. We can call this moral approval, along with its counterpart, moral disapproval. So Hume posits a kind of natural emotional response that human beings have from time to time with respect to features of the world, moral approval and moral disapproval. It arises as a response to certain objects or situations or events. So I see a certain event happening and I have a response of moral approval, or perhaps I have the response of moral disapproval, right? If I see, I don't know, children tormenting a cat, I have an immediate response, and that response is moral disapproval, right? Or if I see a Boy Scout helping an elderly person across the street, I might have the moral response of, or the emotional response of moral approval. That's what he has in mind, that I witness events in the world and it calls forth certain emotional responses from individuals. For Hume, the statement X is good means the same as X is such as to elicit moral approval from all or most normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased people. So there's a lot packed in there. Let me take a moment, pause a moment to unpack it, right? This is a encapsulation of what's sometimes referred to as the ideal observer theory. And the ideal observer theory is trying to make out what certain terms mean by an appeal to the responses of ideal observers, right? So what does it mean to say something is red? To say that something is red, if you're going to take an ideal observer theory account of that, is to say normal colored perceivers would see red under standard observation conditions. That's what it means to say that something is red. Or to say that something is salty is to say that it is such as to elicit a salty response or salty sensation in normal, well, let's relativize it to human beings. Human beings, our language after all, right? That doesn't mean everybody sees red when they look at a red object, right? If you're a colorblind individual, perhaps you don't see red, right? Or if you've just been staring at a bright green screen, or you were out in the sun and your eyes are dazzled, or if it's very dark in the room, you might be looking at a red object, but you don't see red. To say that something is red is not to say that everyone sees it as red, and it isn't to say that I see it as red right now. To say that something is red is to say that most normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased people would see red if they looked at it. In a similar way, what Hume is saying is, to say that something is good is to say that it would elicit moral approval from most normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased people. Does that mean I approve of it right now at this very moment? Maybe I do, but that's not what it means. In fact, maybe I know it to be good, but I don't like it. I don't want to do it, right? That was always a problem for subjectivism. They couldn't make sense of that. How can you believe something to be good, but not want to do it? Or how can you believe something to be bad, but still be tempted? Hume gives us a way of making sense of that. When I say that that is good, I don't mean I personally want to do it or I approve of it in this moment. I mean that I know it is such as to elicit the positive responses of most normal, sensitive, informed, unbiased people. Now, if I know that, but I also don't approve of it, what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that there's something off with me. Maybe I'm not normal, I'm not sensitive, I'm not informed, maybe I'm biased, right? So my approval can be explained by some deficit on my part. Similarly, X is bad means roughly X would elicit the moral disapproval from all or most normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased people. So Hume is giving us an ideal observer account of making sense of moral predicates. I'm limiting it right now to good and bad. Note, good and bad are relational properties. Their very meaning is a relation that occurs between humans and objects, events, etc. This is similar to John Locke's theory of secondary properties. If you want to go back to those notes and kind of review that, maybe that will be helpful to you. If successful, this is a quasi-scientific naturalism which reduces ethical terms to items investigable by science. That's what naturalism does. Naturalism takes a previously non-empirical term, redefines it in a way that allows science to investigate it. So if I take good and I redefine it as that which elicits the positive responses of a certain class of observers, well, that's an empirical prediction then when I say this is good. Theoretically, I put those observers in a room, I present them with the allegedly good thing, and I determine, does it have the predicted responses or not? If all or most of those ideal observers approve, then it's good. If all or most of those ideal observers disapprove, then it's not good. It's bad. And if there is no consensus, some of them approve, some of them disapprove, they don't really have a strong reaction, well, then it's neither good nor bad, right? But notice that's an empirical experiment. I just have to get those people in a room and expose them to the object or the behavior or the event in question. Hume's theory is a relational and psychological, so it's not purely subjective. Hume is not saying that X is good means I, the speaker, approve of X. It is entirely possible for me to sincerely utter X is good, while at the same time intensely disapproving of X. On a side note, Hume basically gives a similar account of excellence in art. And to say that, let's say, Shakespeare is a great writer, for Hume, does not mean I personally like Shakespeare. It means I know Shakespeare is such as to elicit the approval of all or most normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased judges. I may not like Shakespeare at all. Of course, that suggests that there's something deficient about me. But nevertheless, when I say Shakespeare is a great author, what Hume claims is I'm not making a subjective claim, I personally like Shakespeare. I'm making a quasi-objective claim about the subjective responses of a certain class of ideal observers. Hume understands X is good as an empirical prediction about what the subjective responses of a certain class of individuals, ideal observers, not a report about personal subjective responses. So unlike subjectivism, one can be wrong in ethical judgments. Further, there is a role for ethical argument and discussion. Since to be an ideal observer, one must be informed, unbiased, and sensitive, there remains room for argument and refutation in ethical arguments. People may simply be wrong about what they claim to be good, the judgments of ideal observers, and they may revise those judgments when certain facts are brought to light. So notice, if I didn't have all the facts and I thought such and such a practice was good, I might change that opinion when you give me more facts and go, oh, an informed observer would disapprove of X. It's not good after all. When one claims that something is good, according to Hume, one is making an empirical prediction about how a community of normal, sensitive, unbiased humans would react to it if they were fully acquainted with it. So I'm repeating myself here a bit. I recognize that. This is not a subjective claim. It's an empirical prediction about objective facts, a prediction that is either true or false, and which could theoretically be either verified or falsified. Again, put a bunch of ideal observers in a room, expose them to the behavior in question, and then poll them for responses. Notice, too, that it makes perfect sense on Hume's theory for a moral agent to claim that something is good, but that he does not like it, or conversely, that he knows something to be evil, but he desires it nonetheless. As a psychological theory, Hume's thesis may even go some way towards explaining why it is, after learning that something is good, that is, that it's widely approved of, that an agent may come to accept it as well, since for the most part, we like to believe as other people believe. Now, there are certain problems with Hume, right? some might object that good things would be good whether or not the majority of persons approved of them or not. For instance, the abolition of slavery. Notice for a long time, people approved of slavery. They don't approve of it now, but we want to say whether people approved of it or not has nothing to do with its goodness. It was never good, it was always evil, and the people who approved of it in the past were wrong, and the people who disapprove of it now are correct. Right? Accordingly, some may argue against Hume that good things in life call forth approval in sensitive moral agents because they are good and not the other way around. So in other words, one might say the reason why moral agents approve of good things is because they are good, right? So it is the very goodness of the thing that is the cause of the approval and moral approval. What explains communal approval is the goodness of the action and not the other way around. Because notice, Hume seems to be suggesting it's the other way around. It's the communal agreement that calls forth the labeling it as good. But he wants to say, no, it's the being of good which calls forth the communal approval. That's what the objection is claiming. But on Hume's view, right, so that wasn't Hume's view. Hume's view is that nothing would be good or bad if we did not have emotions of approval or disapproval. And so it is our responses that cause us to label things as good or bad. They don't have an inherent goodness or an inherent badness. So that's simply, Hume is simply denying that goodness is an objective feature of the world, simply denying that. Hume offers his account to counter both of two very popular accounts of ethics. So Hume is positioning himself to disagree with alternative views that were very popular in his day. One view that he is trying to shoot down and defeat is the view that ethics can be explained entirely in terms of self-interest and psychological egoism. So Thomas Hobbes had famously argued that human beings are psychological egoists. In other words, the one thing that motivates all human beings is self-interest. That is sort of the natural law of human behavior, and all human behavior is subject to this law of self-interest, preserving one's self-interest. Thomas Hobbes was also an ethical egoist, and he says the right thing for human beings to do is whatever they take to be in their own best interest, right? And he thought ethics could be, Thomas Hobbes thought ethics could be explained merely by appeal to self-interest. Hume thinks this is a mistake, and he denies this. The other view that Hume thinks is a mistake, again, it was very popular during Hume's life, was a view that ethics could be explained entirely in terms of self-evident reasons, and that moral reasons were somehow self-evident, and to act rationally is to act morally, and that immoral behavior always conflicts with reason, and so we can derive our knowledge of right and wrong purely by reason and rational reflection. Hume thinks that's mistaken as well. Again, Hume believes both the view that ethics arises from self-interest and the view that ethics arises from rationality to be mistaken. He says it is emotion, this is Hume now, it is emotion and not reason that is key to understanding both moral judgments and moral motivations. Again, this would be counter to the reason account of ethics. It says you have to understand the role that emotion plays in ethics, and reason doesn't have a place for emotion. Therefore, reason cannot be telling us the story of where ethics comes from or what motivates us to be ethical. However, says Hume, the relevant emotion for ethics is not self-interest, as Hobbes had suggested, but rather other-directed sympathy. So notice, he says Hobbes is right in that he thinks emotion motivates behavior, yes. And Hobbes is also right to say that self-interest is a powerful emotion which motivates behavior. Where Hobbes is wrong is to say that it is the only emotion that motivates behavior, and that it's the relevant emotion when it comes to ethics. On the contrary, what we're going to see is Hume thinks that in addition to self-interest, we are motivated by benevolence. In other words, we are emotionally tied to the welfare of our fellow human beings, and we have a natural instinct to seek their happiness and to try to limit or reduce their suffering. And that is where ethics comes from, according to David Hume. Hume envisions reason as cool and disinterested appreciation of facts. So his understanding of reason is, again, bifurcated from emotion, right? And so reason is simply an appreciation of facts, like reading a headline dispassionately. I see that many people died in an earthquake today. Oh, I see that a wounded war veteran was reunited with his 2-year-old daughter. Those are just facts. But he thinks that once we have the facts, the second step for natural, healthy human beings is an emotional reaction to the facts. But that's not part of the rational appreciation of the facts. The rational appreciation of the facts has to happen first. But then after the rational appreciation of the facts comes emotional responses, right? So I see that many people were killed in an earthquake today. Oh, that's terrible. Or, oh, I see that a wounded war vet was reunited with his 2-year-old daughter. Oh, how wonderful, right? Two different events. The rational appreciation of facts, the emotional response. Remember that Hume believed that reason could only provide us with what he called hypothetical imperatives. The following, what is a hypothetical imperative, right? I guess I don't have it in the slide, but I'll go over it now. Hypothetical, that means it's going to start with if. What's an imperative? It's a command. So it's an if command, right? Generally of the form, if X, then do Y. Do Y is the imperative. That's the command. But do Y is the consequent of a conditional. You have to satisfy the antecedent in order to know whether that imperative applies to or not. So I might say this, if you want to go to medical school, then take General Bio 1 and 2. Should you take General Bio 1 and 2? I don't know. Do you want to go to medical school? So notice the imperative part, take General Bio 1 and 2, that's the consequent, that's the imperative, that's the second half. That only applies to those who meet the antecedent condition. Do you want to go to medical school? So that's what's meant by a hypothetical imperative, right? Let me give a sort of silly example that I always give. Imagine that you and I go to Burger King restaurant. This day, they're having an incredible special on their Whopper meal. I guess I could make this more modern and make a special on their Impossible Whopper, but let's just leave it as their Whopper meal. Their Whopper meal. And the response has been so overwhelming that they set up a special line just to take care of people who want the special Whopper meal. Above one of the registers there is a sign which reads, if you want the special Whopper meal, then stand in this line. So I'm standing next to you. I read the sign along with you. There it is. I see it. I know you to be the paragon of rationality. You are very walking, talking incarnation of reason. And so I turn to you for advice. And I say, oh, paragon of rationality, ought I to stand in that line? Now, you may be the most rational person on the planet. You may be a veritable Mr. Spock of the original series. But before you could answer my question, there's something you would have to find out first. What is that something? What is it that you would need to know before you could answer my question? Well, of course, you would need to ask me, do you want the Whopper meal? But notice what that shows. You, as reason, cannot tell me what to do until I tell you what I want, right? This is why David Hume says that it is desire which motivates action, and reason doesn't even get involved until the desires are active, right? I say later on, I think, famous quote of Hume, reason is and should be the slave of the passions and must not pretend to any other office but to serve and obey them. What does he mean by that? Reason tells us how to get what we want, and that's all it can do. It gives us hypothetical imperatives. If you want to go to medical school, then take General Bio 1 and 2. If you want to pass the exam, then study. If you want the Whopper meal, stand in that line. But those are if. They give you no direction until desire fills in the first half. Oh, yes, I do want a Whopper meal. Or no, I don't want to go to medical school. Yes, I do want to get a good grade on the exam. The desires are what motivates our action. Reason just tells us the most efficient way to acquire the thing desired. It could only tell you, a reason can only tell us what to do once we tell reason what we wanted. That's the nature of a hypothetical imperative of the form, if X, then do Y. And more usually, if you want X, then do Y. This is what led there's my quote. This is what led Hume to say, reason is and ought only be the slave of the passions and never can pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Ethical matters, by contrast, tend to be passionate affairs. So reason is the dispassionate appreciation of facts. Ethical matters tend to be passionate affairs. Again, more reason for thinking that it's not our rationality, which is the source of ethics or ethical motivation. Further, ethical judgments always involve some measure of approval or disapproval. Therefore, reason objectively informs us of facts, but does not cause us to approve or disapprove of those facts, and so, Hume thinks, cannot be the source of ethical judgments. So, reason plays a role in ethical judgments. It helps us appreciate facts. But after reason does its job of giving us the facts, then emotion finishes the job by giving us the response of approval or the response of disapproval. It would, from the vantage point of reason, says Hume, it would not be irrational for me to prefer the death of 1,000 Orientals to the pricking of the little finger. Now, of course, it's dated language, and so we have to kind of forgive him for that. But what does he mean by that? Of course, one of those options is far more moral than the other. It would be far more moral to preserve the life of 1,000 people and allow the pricking of my little finger than to preserve my little finger at the expense of a death of 1,000. Right? Clearly, that's true, but it's not reason that tells us that. It's moral approval or disapproval, and more broadly, it is emotion that makes us aware of that. Right? So that's an emotional response to the facts. It's not a fact in and of itself. Further, Hume famously maintains that one cannot rationally derive an ought from an is. What does he mean by that? He means that no amount of information about how the world is can justify judgments about how the world ought to be, or vice versa. No amount of information about how the world ought to be can give us information about how the world is. Right? So how is the world? Well, the world is a world where people donate to charity and they cheat on their taxes, and they help elderly people across the street, and they steal their Social Security checks. That's what people do. That's how the world is. However, some of those behaviors are behaviors they ought to engage in, and others of those behaviors are behaviors they ought not to engage in. And if, according to Hume, reason doesn't tell us which is which. What does tell us which is which? Emotions. More specifically, the emotions of moral approval and moral disapproval. Still further, since ethical judgments are meant to be action guiding, they must in some way be involved with motives. Reason, he claims, does not and cannot motivate action. Again, it's just the dry, dispassionate appreciation of facts. It is only emotions like desire or hate or love that actually motivate actions. Now, this is not to say reason plays no role. Reason is necessary for the appreciation of relevant facts of the situation, particularly relevant facts for ethical judgments. But what facts are relevant to moral judgments according to Hume? facts about the tendency of certain actions to lead to human happiness. Now here I'm saying something new now. We're approaching new material. Hume thought that if we believed an action tends to result in happiness, human happiness, we tend to approve of it. Conversely, Hume thought if we believe an action tends to result in misery, we tend to disapprove of it. But the attraction to human happiness and the repulsion to human misery is due to emotional features about us and not reason. This is the faculty of sympathy that Hume posits, right? He says that all or most all human beings, certainly the healthy, normal ones, have this natural capacity for sympathy. And all he means by that is we tend to be pleased by the happiness and the flourishing of our fellow human beings. We tend to be displeased by the suffering we witness in our fellow human beings. Now, that's a tendency. He thinks it's a natural tendency. He also thinks that it can be overridden. So if I see my neighbor struggling with her groceries when she arrives home from the store, and one of the bag breaks and all the groceries fall all over the ground, I might go, oh, how awful. I might even be motivated to go out and assist her, right? Unless I really dislike her. Unless, her dog poops on my yard, and, she plays her music too loud, has always got parties going every weekend. And so maybe I really dislike her. And so when something terrible happens to her, maybe I chuckle, ha, 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 or something like that, right? So our natural tendency to sympathy can be overridden by other things like self-interest, right? But generally speaking, for most normal, healthy human beings, we tend to approve of those behaviors that we think result in human happiness. We tend to disapprove of those behaviors we think will result in human misery. Two more arguments against the sufficiency of reason for moral knowledge. Number one, the contrast between what Hume calls geometrical reasoning and moral reasoning. Geometrical reasoning, we might just call it logical reasoning, is a case of pure rational judgment. Notice that we first observe the relations of points and lines, etc., and then proceed to deduce other relations that were not before obvious to us. Or in the case of logical reasoning, when presented with a valid argument, the conclusion is entailed by the truth of the premises. And so one has all of the facts one needs when one has all of the premises, right? But moral reasoning is not the case of pure rational judgments. To pass moral judgments, we must know all of the facts first before we pass the judgment. So the judgment isn't simply the culmination of the facts. The judgment is something that happens after we have all the facts together. Reason, again, the apprehension of facts, must have completed its task before the business of moral judgment can begin. So again, this is an argument Hume offers to suggest that reason is not the source of moral knowledge or moral motivation. Therefore, Hume argues, the goodness or badness of a situation cannot simply be another fact, which reason discloses, since, in the scenario described above, all the facts are in and I still don't know whether the thing is good or bad. Why? Because I haven't had the emotional reaction yet. So the facts are acquired, but the addition of emotion is what leads me to make the further moral judgment of goodness or badness. The second is the ultimate ends of actions. This is a second argument against the self-sufficiency of reason as a source of moral knowledge and motivation. We may ask for the reason for a particular action or of a desire, but at some point the questions just don't make sense anymore. In other words, I might be going to school because I want to get a degree, and I may want a degree because I want to make money, and I may want to make a lot of money because I want to enjoy my life. But if you continue to ask me, but why, but why, but why, but why, at some point I stop and I say, because I just do, because I just desire. So there are certain rational relationships between our actions, right? If I think that getting a good education is my most efficient means to getting a good salary, which is my most efficient means to making a lot of money, which is my, well, okay, then that all makes sense. But at the end is not something I choose as a matter of reason. It's something I choose as a matter of emotion. I want to be happy. I want to flourish. I want to enjoy myself, right? Why? I just do. It is simply a desire. So at the end of this chain of A for B, B for C, C for D, which may have rational relations, practical rational relations, at the end of that chain is standing something I've selected purely for emotional reasons and desire, at least according to David Hume. Hume claims that this demonstrates that the ultimate ends of actions are desires, not reasons. This shows, again, as Hume put it, reason is the slave of the passions, right? The role of reason is to tell us the most efficient means to acquire that which we desire. But reason is totally ineffective in telling us what it is we desire, or for that matter, what it is we should desire. Hume claims that while we may rationally criticize the means to ends, one cannot rationally criticize the ends themselves. What does he mean by that? Well, if you're taking human biology and you want to go to medical school, I could say, hey, that was stupid. You still have to take general bio 1 and 2. Human biology is not a prerequisite for medical school, right? So I'm criticizing your means, but I can't criticize your ends. Your ends, those are not subject to rational criticism. Now, let's keep in mind, just as a point of contrast, it may make Hume more clear here. Aristotle would disagree, right? Aristotle thought that there were natural ends for human beings to select. And if you were selecting ends at odds with your nature, then you have made an irrational choice of ends, not just an irrational choice of means, but an irrational choice of ends. For instance, one might try as hard as one can to be a tree and seek the most rational, efficient means to be a tree, right? Water oneself, stand in nurturing soil, etc., get lots of sun, right? But one is engaged in an absurd quest, not because one has selected an inefficient means to one's end, but one's selected an irrational end, according to Aristotle. Again, Aristotle would say not that one has chosen ill-advised means to her end. He would rather say that she has chosen an irrational end, an end incompatible with one's nature. Hume didn't agree with that. So that's just a point of difference between Hume and Aristotle. Now, we might ask, do those things which are good, in other words, those things we tend to label good, do they have any common characteristics? More simply, what is it that good things got that bad things don't? Right? What is it about good things, or at least the things we call good, that makes them such as to elicit moral approval? Hume holds that this question can only be settled by empirical observation and generalization. It is then a question for psychology, sociology, and anthropology to answer. So he does think that we are caused to label certain things good and bad. He thinks that what causes us to label things good and bad is a fair question, and it's a question that can be answered by the empirical sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, whatnot. But he hypothesizes, and we've already seen what his hypothetical, what his theory or his theory is, right? His theory is what causes us to label certain things good or bad is the fact that we believe them to either tend to result in human flourishing and happiness or tend to result in human misery and suffering. He offers his tentative answers. We've already said that. And it seems to be supported by his observations. So again, this isn't a priori speculation. He thinks this is informed by his commerce with the world, his observations of the world. So things approved of fall into two main categories, according to Hume: those which are immediately pleasant, either to their possessors or others, and those which are useful ultimately and indirectly to the production of pleasure, either to their possessors or others. So those things are approved of which are pleasant, right? Again, something which is causing pleasant sensations or pleasant mental engagement or whatnot. or those things which are useful to the production of pleasure. Now, Hume is not claiming that good means pleasure or pleasant. So he's not exactly a hedonist here, right? He's making an empirical claim about what causes us to label things good or bad. He wants to say that good things are coextensive with the pleasant or the pleasurable. It's only upon investigation and reflection that we come to realize this. So two sets may be coextensive, and named by different predicates, but the predicates don't necessarily mean the same thing, right? Oh, I thought I say this in the next slide. What do I mean by that? Well, it so happens that animals with hearts is coextensive with the set of animals with lungs. Those two phrases, all animals with hearts and all animals with lungs, are coextensive, such that anyone with one has the other and vice versa, right? Oh, I take that back. Let's do animals with hearts and animals with circulatory systems. Put it that way. Right? Because fish have hearts, but they don't have lungs. That's what I'm saying. Or respiratory systems, if we understand respiratory systems to include gills. Right, there we go. Let's go with that. Animals with hearts are animals with respiratory systems and vice versa. So they name coextensive sets. How do we know they name coextensive sets? It's not because they mean the same thing. They mean quite distinct things. It's a matter of our empirical investigation of the world that we came to discover all the animals with hearts also happen to be animals with respiratory systems and vice versa, right? So good might be coextensive with the pleasant and the pleasurable, but that doesn't mean those terms mean the same thing. They mean distinct things. It just so happens that upon reflection and observation, we discover that they name coextensive sets. Hume postulates the existence of another sentiment, which he calls sympathy, benevolence, or humanity. Right? He uses different names from time to time. When I say another sentiment, he means in addition to self-interest, we have benevolence. Right? And this explains moral motivation and the experience of moral approval and disapproval. Sympathy for him is a feature of healthy human beings which disposes them to feel pleased when contemplating the happiness of any human being and to feel displeased when contemplating any human being as being miserable. Naturally, this disposition can be overridden by circumstance or by disease or by self-interest, right? So if you are sociopath, for instance, maybe you don't possess this feature of benevolence, but that's a pathology, and that explains why you don't, the suffering of others doesn't affect you negatively, or the happiness of others doesn't affect you positively. 4 points about sympathy. 1, he thinks it's common to all or nearly all human beings. 2, he thinks it's excited by the perception or thought of any human being in such a state of happiness or in such a state of misery. Number 3, he thinks we approve of those things which tend to result in human happiness because the thought of human happiness is good. In other words, it's pleasant. We enjoy contemplating other human beings, so therefore we're motivated to do it. We are disposed to think of things which tend to result in human misery, to disapprove, rather. We are disposed to disapprove of things which tend to result in human misery because the very thought of misery is unpleasant and therefore bad. Right? So notice we're hardwired to feel bad when we think about and contemplate humans in suffering or those behaviors which bring about suffering, etc. Right? The emotion of approval itself is pleasant, and that of disapproval is unpleasant. So we're gratified when we see things going the way we like them to go, and we are approving of what's going on. We are distressed when we see things going the way we don't like them to go, and we find that unpleasant. All right, so so far so good. And by the way, I'm going to talk about certain problems now with Hume, but before I talk about the problems, I admit that I'm somewhat sympathetic. It's kind of a pun. I didn't realize it until this moment, but I'm somewhat sympathetic to Hume's account of ethical predicates. I think he gets something very right about our natural impulse towards sympathy and that which motivates us to treat one another with compassion, right? I mean, this is why when I'm thumbing through a magazine and I see a picture of, I don't know, a child malnourished, I'm motivated to give to that charity, right? Why? Because why? I don't know that child. That child plays no active role in my life, but the mere thought of a child suffering in that way moves me to act. So I think he's right about that. I think from personal experience, let's just say, I think that what he has to say about hypothetical imperatives is very good, right? Hypothetical imperatives, which are commands or requirements that apply to some people, sometimes under certain circumstances. And these are the imperatives that we get from practical matters. So if I'm trying to change a tire or I'm trying to go to medical school or whatnot. So I think what he has to say about hypothetical imperatives is interesting and important. Also notice the more I identify with my fellow human beings, right? I see them as kind of like me. I sympathize and empathize with them. The more motivated I am to treat them well and to seek their happiness. Conversely, the less I identify with the plight of my fellow human beings, the less I see myself in them, and the less I imagine their suffering like my suffering, the less I'm motivated to treat them with compassion. Also notice this is the thinking that goes behind certain therapies for violent criminals. Maybe you're aware of this, that in certain kinds of redress therapies, what the therapist does is try to establish an emotional link between the victimizer and his victim or her victim. And you ask them questions. Well, how did you think that made her feel? Well, why do you suppose she was crying? Well, what do you think was going on in her mind? In other words, try to get that victimizer into the mind of her victim or his victim. Why? Because it would be unpleasant to live in that space. You go, oh, they probably were very upset. Well, they probably were very sad. And that will make them feel sad and therefore less likely to repeat these kinds of offenses. At least this is one of the thinking that goes into that kind of therapy, right? To build empathy. And this is something we should do with our children, and I think it makes for a more peaceful world. So Hume has me on certain aspects of his view. Nevertheless, I do think there are problems with his account. For one thing, even if reason is not the source of moral motivation, that does not in and of itself show that reason is not and cannot be the source of moral knowledge. Notice sociopaths seem to know the difference between right and wrong. They just aren't motivated to do what is right or avoid what is wrong, right? Now, if that's an accurate statement of what's going on, then we can say I can know right from wrong without having emotions or having the appropriate emotions or the emotions Hume is talking about. So to say, it's these emotions that are the source of moral knowledge, and without them, moral knowledge is impossible, well, sociopath seems to stand as a counterexample to that view. The other problem I want to point out, and I think is a bigger problem, but it's a systematic problem with anyone who tries to give an ideal observer account as a way of explaining a term that we use, right? And that the problem can be encapsulated with the rhetorical question, how old is the ideal observer, right? So to be sure, we use ideal observer accounts a lot, right? For instance, in law, some of you might already be familiar with, there's a concept of what's called the reasonable person. In more sexist days, it was called the reasonable man, right? But it's something meaning like the normal, rational individual. And so in order to say whether there is deception in advertising, it's not enough to say, well, the claims they made are false. You'd have to ask, would the reasonable person be deceived by this, right? Maybe they're making outlandish claims. Maybe they're making claims that are referred to as puffery, which is, an over-exaggeration. The most luxurious ship to sail the Caribbean, right? But the question is, would a reasonable person be deceived by this in some way, right? But that requires something like an ideal observer, the normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased individual, right? Definitions of obscenity often employ the notion of something like it would be deemed obscene by an ideal observer. In other words, such and such is obscene is to say it is such as to elicit an obscene reaction in an ideal judge. Notice, subjectivism doesn't work in judgments of obscenity if you're trying to produce public policy, right? Because if you're a subjectivist with regard to obscenity, then if anybody finds something as obscene, it's obscene for that person. And if anybody doesn't find something obscene, it's not obscene for that person. And so we can have horrible, graphic, violent depictions, not obscene, because, Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't have a problem with it, right? Or you could have Disney animation as obscene because someone who's super sensitive is having a problem with it. Well, that's not going to work if we're going to have regulations restricting access or the access of certain individuals to obscene content, right? You need something like an ideal observer theory. At least this is what has been alleged, and this is what we employ as a matter of, if you were to look at, I think it's called the Miller test in obscenity, in case in the early 70s, right? The view of obscenity maintains that something is obscene is not a report of one's personal response to the object, but rather to predict the subjective responses of most normal people, we might say. According to this view, to say an image, or let's say an image, is obscene is to say that the normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased person would have an obscene reaction to it. Again, ideal is cashed out in terms such as normal, sensitive, informed, and unbiased. Even certain scientific observations are predictions about the judgments of the subjective states of a certain class of observers under a certain set of observation conditions. As noted earlier in this presentation, to say that something is red is to say is such as to appear red to a normal color perceiver under standard observation conditions, right? So those are all instances where we do employ something like the ideal observer theory, something like what Hume is doing in ethics. Why is that a problem? Well, the problem arises making out the specifics as to what constitutes an ideal observer. For instance, how old is the ideal observer? What gender is the ideal observer? What sexual orientation is the ideal observer? What religious affiliation does the ideal observer have? Right? Now, one might say, oh, but none of those things matter. But wait a minute, is that true? We know that what you approved of at 20, you might not approve of at 30. And I got to tell you, it's looking like you might not approve of it at 60. I'm not quite there yet. I'm almost, right? But the things that I found pleasant and appealing at one point in my life, I don't necessarily find pleasant and appealing at another point. It seems my aging has changed those preferences in an important way. Gender clearly changes things like what constitutes sexual harassment, right? Men and women generally do not always agree as to what remarks constitute sexual harassment or not. Sexual orientation does seem to affect, of course, what sexual depictions you find offensive and what sexual depictions you don't find offensive, right? Religious affiliation certainly has a great deal to do with what you tend to approve of or disapprove of. So all of these things and dozens of others, I mean, I just did a handful here. Right? More to the point here, is it true that when one comes to moral, to the point here, is that true when one comes to moral? Oh, I guess while I'm asking, I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't read my own bullets. But so to say none of these things matter, of course it does matter when you're making judgments. And particularly doesn't it matter when you're making judgments about those things of which you morally approve and those things of which you morally disapprove. Don't all the factors affect what one deems morally good and morally bad? Put another way, imagine we're going to carry out the research project suggested by Hume's account of ethical judgments. We wish to determine whether some behavior is ethical or not, so we decide to put a lot of people, ideal observers that is, we decide to put a lot of ideal observers in a room, present them with all the relevant facts, and then poll them for their reactions. Right? The idea here is that if all or nearly all of them approve of the action, it is, if all or nearly all disapprove of the action, it is immoral. If all or nearly all approve of the action, it is moral. And if there is no consensus one way or the other, then the action is neither moral nor immoral. Right? That would seem to be what we ought to be doing if we're trying to establish what's right and wrong, and if Hume is correct in his account of moral predicates. The problem is, whom do we let into the room? Well, we might say that we would not let anyone into the room whose judgments is swayed by age or gender or religious affiliation or sexual orientation, and that such individuals would not be ideal observers, so they don't get to vote. But this seems bizarre. Surely these features of real individuals always affect what they approve of or disapprove of. One's moral approval or disapproval, it would seem, is highly affected by, or perhaps completely the product of, the personal history one has as an individual. Screening out individuals because of their sense of morality has been affected by their personal moral history, would mean that the only people getting into the room would be ahistorical, genderless, ageless, religious individuals with no religious persuasion or sexual orientation. Who would such individuals be? Right? They would be complete fictions. Right? These would be completely fictitious creatures, to be sure. And Lord in heaven only knows what preferences these fictitious creatures would have. But further, it's not clear what relevance those fictitious preferences would have to us, actual human beings, and our morality. One might seek to circumvent this difficulty by abandoning talk of the normal person or ideal observer writ large, and limit the scope relativized to something like community standards of individuals, something like that, right? This, of course, is done in cases of obscenity in law, right? So not the average human being, maybe there's just too many different personal histories running around, we're not going to get consensus, but maybe the average American person. Right? But that might still be too broad. Well, what about the average Floridian? Well, that also seems rather broad. Well, maybe the average Dade County resident. Yes, but that would need to include the average Hialeah, the average Miami Beacher, the average Opelika resident, the average Davie resident, the average Kendall resident. Do we need to relativize down to those smaller communities? Do we have to narrow down to the neighborhood, to the street address? Again, once we begin relativizing to smaller and smaller communities, it would seem that we're very close to returning to subjectivism. X is good means X is such as to be approved of by me, or the ideal me. But that's subjectivism. And of course, then the account loses its supposed advantage that it had over subjectivism's account of moral predicates. This is not merely a problem for Hume's account of ethical predicates, but for any ideal observer account of a term. So if you're trying to understand a term, the reasonable person in law, as an ideal observer, these issues become relevant, right? What gender is the reasonable person? What sexual orientation is the reasonable person? How old is the reasonable person? What IQ is the reasonable person, right? We can start to, I think the device is used, and so far it seems to be doing an okay job, but it's problematic, right? Summing up then, moral terms such as good and bad derive their meaning and use from human sentiments of approval and disapproval. We generally and naturally approve of pleasurable things and disapprove of what is painful. This is how it is we form basic value judgments. However, we are also endowed by nature with the sentiment of benevolence. This natural instinct causes us to delight in the good fortune of fellow humans and to commiserate in their grief. For this reason, we approve of actions and events and rules that we believe will benefit the human community on a whole and call them good. Those actions and events and rules that tend to produce human misery, we call bad. It is through the vicarious pain and pleasure that we experience while perceiving the plight of others that we come to limit our own self-interest and temper them with our actions with moral rules. Right? All right, so that concludes my presentation on David Hume's ethics. I hope that was helpful and useful to you, and that will conclude. I thank you for your attention.